All right. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Happy to have you here with us again for yet another webinar organized by the Women in Finance and Investment Network. And as you're aware of, we are currently doing our ESG series. So we are coming with ESG related topics. And happy to have you again with us. And as you're aware, I am Dikshita Autahua. Today, I will be your moderator to ease out the journey, ensuring that we have a smooth journey with our expert here while we discuss this topic. For those who have joined us for the very first time, warm welcome to you. And let me just give you a very brief and quick info on the organization. Well, we are a US-based nonprofit membership-based organization, and what we are looking to achieve is gender parity in the global financial sector. We are currently working with several organizations and platforms to attain this gender parity or gender equity and increase visibility of women in the finance and investment management industry. Well, if you'd like more information about our organization or what we do or how you can benefit from it, whether it's as a member or a partner of the organization, please feel free to visit the website at www.wiffinglobal.org, or you can also send us an email on info@wiffinglobal.org, and we shall attend to you in as soon as possible. Now, coming to the discussion of today, we've seen over the past decade that considering ESG policies in the organizational strategy was only expected of global corporations. There were organizations that had extensive and complex relationships with stakeholders involved in their operations. However, in recent years, we've seen that businesses of all sizes have been increasingly recognizing the importance of incorporating ESG in their strategic decision-making. They're recognizing ESG's importance in building trust with stakeholders and achieving long-term success. We find that there are pools of evidence and wide variety of recommendations from multilateral agencies on the importance of developing partnerships, and I emphasize partnerships, to achieve sustainability. Now, the purpose of this webinar is to establish the characteristics of partnerships that could be related to greater improvements in firm sustainability, in building effective partnerships and encourage sustainability. So starting today's conversation, which is the importance of partnership in maximizing a company's ESG impact, we have amongst us our ESG expert, Mrs. Annalisa. You are Mrs. or Miss?
Definitely Miss, and good evening, everyone.
So we have our ESG expert with us, Miss Annalisa Keke, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Redefine Properties Limited, which is based in South Africa. Now, let me read the brief of Annalisa to you. Annalisa is widely regarded as the go-to source as a remuneration practitioner, a keynote speaker, and editor at Redefine Properties. Before joining the organization, Annalisa was a senior manager in the reward practice of a leading professional services firm specializing in tax, legal, and governance matters. She holds both LLB and MCOM tax qualifications from the University of Cape Town. In her current role, Ms. KK is responsible for further evolving Redefine's ESG strategies to achieve the application of best practice ESG principles in the management of Redefine's real estate assets, sorry. And Lisa, very warm welcome to you. We are finally able to host you on our platform. I know you've been having a very tight schedule over the past month. So thank you once again for accepting our invitation. Hello, and Lisa.
Dikshita, thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. It's past 5 o'clock on my side of the world. I'm based in South Africa, and I actually had to come down to the Eastern Cape, which is about 1,000 kilometers away from Johannesburg, where I'm based, in order to visit my mother. So I'm actually at my mother's house right now, but it's great to join all of you regardless.
Yes, we're happy to have you here as well. And Lisa, before we start with the actual presentations that she has prepared for us, let me just give you a brief of today's format. So, and Lisa, she has a presentation with the topic of matter at hand. So before that, let me just give you the breakdown. We'll go through the presentation with her, and after that we will have a Q&A session. So just a gentle reminder to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, if you've got questions or things that you'd like to add in as we move forward with our webinar of today, please use the Q&A box that you find on your screen and drop us your messages, your feedback, your opinions, your questions, recommendations, and we shall discuss and take questions during the Q&A session that we will have at the end of this webinar. And Lisa, over to you. Please, let's start.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I'm not going to do the death by PowerPoint thing. I've got a few slides prepared, which I'm going to share now. And really the point is to illustrate how partnerships can play out in the context of ESG. Obviously, I'll pepper in some examples, but they will be real estate specific examples because I'm in the real estate sector. But it's important, I think, right at the start to say that no company can really walk their ESG journey alone. It's important to rope in multiple stakeholders, and really even underlying this approach, it's important for every company to have a solid grasp of who the key stakeholders are in its kind of business model, and how exactly its ESG strategy is going to positively or negatively impact each of those key stakeholders. So an example of that would be, deciding in the interests of investors, especially, we've just come out of COVID. A lot of companies have had to make this decision, deciding, to actually withhold paying a dividend. That in itself, even though it's economic, it is a sustainability measure because you're looking after the long-term sustainability of the business. So in the short term, there might be, a negative impact on your investors, including on the employees who hold shares in the company, as well as the retail investors who depend on the dividend income, as part of their daily finances. But in the long term, you are ensuring the sustainability of the business. So those types of trade-offs between different stakeholders are critical when considering a solid ESG strategy. I think to simply paint an ESG strategy as being all, rainbows and sparkles and glitter, and pretending that there couldn't possibly be any negative impact or unintended consequences, I think is a little bit disingenuous. So I think I just wanted to start off the presentation on that note. So how I'm going to proceed. First, I will just walk you through the key components of ESG. You might have already covered this in previous presentations, but it always helps to give a bit of a refresh. And then I'll be taking you through an introduction to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I think will form the basis of the analysis to follow. Because really the goals themselves, not a lot of people really understand what they're about or what they're trying to achieve. But if you really were to boil it down, it's to make sure that governments and corporations and civil society groups globally are taking coordinated action to advance each of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in order to meet the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. And I'll unpack that a little bit more. I know I've used a lot of big words. So after that, I'll be taking you through some of the key concepts of impact and partnerships, and the positive effect that partnerships can have on a company's long-term ESG impact. And then lastly, I will be walking you through a few examples of partnerships in the ESG context, which will hopefully give you an idea of what would count as an ESG partnership in this context. All right, so let's talk about the key components very quickly. I kind of break it up into environmental, social, and governance, which is a useful prism through which to consider sustainability. But even that division, in a way, is artificial. Because if you really dig into what ESG is really about, each element is interconnected. So for example, you can't have a strong environmental approach if it is not underlined or supported not only by forward-looking targets, but also by sound internal governance processes. So who within the organization is responsible for implementing and monitoring and then reporting on the environmental initiatives that the company has undertaken. Similarly then, from a social perspective, it's important to show how each element of the social pillar, which can include customer relations, downstream in the value chain, human capital as well, taking care of your employees, looking at gender equality and fair and responsible remuneration, but also looking at health and safety, as well as fundamental human rights, and upstream in the value chain, how a company is treating its suppliers. All of those different factors, especially and including on the environmental front, need to be incorporated into a company's risk management framework. Because it's one thing to say, oh, we're doing a lot of good work when it comes to the social pillar and the environmental pillar. But if you're really looking at best practice from an ESG perspective, what you're really looking at are the ESG related risks and opportunities. From an environmental, social, and indeed governance perspective, and then you are incorporating those into your mitigating actions at an enterprise level and potentially at a subsidiary level, and you're incorporating them into your long-term enterprise risk management framework. And obviously then, as circumstances change, those would need to be updated. But the point of it is to understand that all of these aspects here are interrelated. And you cannot, as a corporation or as a practitioner, consider one of them to the exclusion of the others. And I know to some of you that seems fairly trite, but you'd be amazed at how much people's internal biases come into this discussion about priorities and understanding of ESG. And an example of that, there are a lot of companies who talk a good game and will say they're very serious about ESG and they're looking at the environmental, management of their organizations. And then, when they get asked, all right, but what about gender equality? They say, that's got nothing to do with us. Because the people in charge don't believe that gender equality is an underpin of ESG. And that is a reflection of internal bias. But if they were looking at it objectively, they would realize that gender equality has an impact on all three of these aspects of environmental, social, and governance. Obviously, with respect to the audience, I will be peppering in the elements of gender equality as I go. But where I come from, for example, the executive team, before the changes were made on the 1st of March, and this is a matter of public record, the entire executive team was made up of men. So the question of gender equality has loomed large, even within my setup. All right, so looking at the environmental section, I mean, a lot of this would be fairly self-explanatory, just noting that when you're looking at climate risks, you're looking at the transitional climate risks, i.e., what are the consequences, the financial consequences to the business of failing to take steps to adapt to a low carbon economy? So can the business survive in an environment where effectively fossil fuels will be phased out, probably by 2030? And that's, listen, we're hoping and praying that a lot of, global governments do manage to meet that goal. But in that environment, to what extent would a business have to overhaul its entire service offering or product offering, as well as other elements of its business model? So, for example, its funding strategy, in order to survive and thrive in a low carbon economy. Because a failure to do so could effectively mean that in between the changing customer expectations, and there's the overlap with social, as well as changing investor and funder expectations, that eventually the company itself could end up becoming obsolete or unable to compete in that low carbon economy, simply because they never made the switch to decide, we need to take drastic steps in order to make sure that our products will be competitive in a low carbon scenario. Then you've got your physical climate risks, your extreme weather events like floods, etc. And in South Africa, we've seen the devastating effects of climate change already in one of our coastal provinces. They've been buffeted by heavy rains, which have, shockingly actually destroyed key infrastructure, entire roads and buildings that have been standing for decades have been swept away in the floods. So the physical climate risks are already manifesting. And those types of once in a century weather events, I think are going to end up becoming once in every few years kind of events. And so there's a drastic amount of adaptation that is going to be required of many companies, and really of many governments, if they hope to survive in an environment where extreme weather events, as well as chronic weather changes such as droughts, become more commonplace, more frequent, and more extreme. Then from a governance perspective, we've spoken about it a bit, but looking at that element of compliance and reporting, because one of the most difficult parts of managing an ESG is coming from whether the data is reliable, whether it is complete, whether it is relied on to make key business decisions and investment decisions. So the rule of thumb is, because I think there's a widespread perception that it's not necessary to have strong data management systems when it comes to ESG. It's intangible, it's difficult to define. A lot of people say it's it's soft and fluffy. But really, if you want to give effect to a strong ESG strategy, you are actually taking steps to make sure that all of the data, including from an environmental and a social and a governance perspective, is reliable enough to be independently verified. If the information is not verifiable, then chances are your ESG strategy itself is built on shaky ground, because that data should be actually informing not only your ESG strategy, but also the key decisions that you make, which I think is a good point to make in the context of partnerships, because you can't really make a decision on which organizations you should partner with if you yourself don't know the key data underlying your ESG strategy, because that in turn will inform your ESG risk management strategy as well. All right, so let's quickly just talk about the UN SDGs. So the Sustainable Development Goals, there are about 17 of them, and they are an urgent call to action by all countries to partner together to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Now, the goals are very ambitious, and each of the goals is supported by a set of targets. The targets are really aimed at governments more than kind of private corporations, but there is guidance available from the United Nations Global Compact on how exactly companies can translate those big global targets into business-related targets. There's no single company, for example, that can bring an end to youth unemployment, or end or drastically reduce the infant mortality rate globally, or road traffic accidents. But a company within its core business can potentially make a positive impact on one or more of those massive overarching targets, and which can help contribute towards the achievement of the long-term sustainable development goals. So when you're thinking about the goals, don't be daunted by the fact that they are so broad and that they are aimed really at governments and regional blocs. Think about how your company can take practical steps towards actually achieving them. And it's important to understand, even in the context of the UN SDGs, how exactly each of them is relevant at each critical stage of the life cycle of an asset or product, as it were. Because some life cycles, if it's a food stuff or fungible, it will be fairly short, a matter of months. The same applies to fashion, by the way. Whereas if your product is a building, like it is for redefined properties, then your product is going to last for about 40 years. And that horizon then becomes a lot longer. So just looking at an example of the progress that's been made against the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is a snapshot that I pulled from the 2021 Sustainable Development Report for South Africa. It's called the SDG Tracker. You can each go onto the UN website and look for the SDG Tracker for your respective country. But this just gives an indication of the fact that globally, and this applies to all key role players across the globe, we are falling behind on the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We are not on track to meet them by 2030. And unfortunately, at the rate that things are going, we will not be on track to meet them by 2030. And the potential consequences of that, of letting even one of these goals slip or fail to be fulfilled, could be catastrophic for the business, for really the planet, but also for individual businesses. So if you look at this, you've got an indication of how South Africa is doing. South Africa is ranked 107th out of 165 countries that are surveyed by the United Nations. And you see, based on the arrows on the screen, that that progress against some of these key SDGs like no poverty or quality education is actually decreasing. And on a lot of others, progress has stagnated. So it's not looking good on a lot of fronts. However, in the context of partnerships, in a way, this provides an opportunity, because effectively, a company should be looking to create partnerships around the SDGs that will require the most improvement, because those are the ones that will have the greatest potential for impact creation. So I know when you're talking about ESG, the term quick wins is bandied about quite a bit. But actually, if you really want to create tangible impact for one or more of your key stakeholders, you should be looking at the areas that require the most effort. And then from there, looking at the key role players within your own ecosystem that have a direct impact on one or more of those goals. So for example, What is SDG Goal 2 is zero hunger, which, as the name suggests, focuses on food security. But even in that discussion for food security, there's a very strong element of climate change, because climate change poses an imminent threat to global food security in the long term, imminently, but also in the long term. So Redefine, for example, is a real estate company. We don't produce food, we don't supply food. So zero hunger would not necessarily be directly relevant to us. However, a lot of tenants, especially those in our retail centers, are food producers. They are restaurants, they are also food distributors, and even those who have rented property from us in our industrial portfolio are using our industrial facilities to manufacture food. So there is potential for us to reach out and partner with some of those tenants, and see them as more than simply a customer in the value chain, but as a partner to actually start taking action, positive action to address zero hunger. So think of it in that way, to say, all right, this is not necessarily within part of the company's core business, but are there other stakeholders who actually do have a direct impact on some of these SDGs that we could potentially work with in order to create real impact? And sometimes it doesn't require a massive financial investment. Sometimes it just requires you to put the right people in touch with the right people. And I've seen that in my own professional life, where, in South Africa, we don't necessarily have an established sustainability forum, where, let's say investors and, companies and government can all come together and decide collectively on how to deal with key sustainability challenges. So what comes out of that is you have one interest group or civil society group doing excellent work on this end, and then you have another key civil society group doing work on that end, but they don't know of each other and they're not talking to each other. So sometimes your role in this can actually be as easy as putting some of these initiatives and these role players together in the same room, to encourage them to come together to reach a common solution that can help everyone, because some of these challenges are so overwhelming. It is not reasonable for corporates to simply sit back and expect the government to do so, because that is not always the most efficient approach. Regulation often lacks nuance and is, by design, inflexible. Whereas these kinds of partnerships outside of the regulatory framework can potentially maximize impact without the red tape. All right, so this section, I think I would also encourage you to look at the SDG compass, where effectively talks about impact and partnerships. And it clearly indicates that effectively addressing sustainability issues cannot be carried out in isolation. So, for example, a lot of companies in and out of the real estate sector, their carbon emissions, there's a certain element of their carbon emissions that are produced by them directly, but most of them are actually sitting downstream in the value chain. Therefore, if a company really wants to get serious about managing its long-term carbon footprint, it can't simply focus on its own operations. It has to think about the operations of those within the value chain as well. So in order for us to meet net zero, and I know you've probably all come across that term somewhere in the media, it's important to work with people. And to work with other stakeholders in order to meet that target. There is no company, or there are very few companies, that can simply reach true net zero single-handedly without engagement or partnership with their key stakeholders. So we've got three types of partnerships. We've got the value chain partnerships that I've been talking about at length, and note that it talks about combining complementary skills, technologies, and resources to potentially bring new solutions to the market. And there, I think it's worth noting as well that a lot of key decision makers assume that ESG is something that cannot be monetized. It is costly, and it is something you have to do for PR, but it is not actually a business opportunity. But this, when you're thinking about this concept of value chain partnerships, becomes quite clear that actually it is a business opportunity that has a real business benefit. Then you've got your sector initiatives, where industry leaders come together to try and find a solution to commonly held problems. And these ones, if you're doing it within a recognized industry body, I don't think you would necessarily have to worry about the, competition regulations. But you always just check with your lawyer on that one. But I think the point is that yes, a company has its competitors and can't give away trade secrets. But the reality of the situation is there are a lot of challenges that all companies in a particular sector are facing. And it is going to get to the point where those challenges become so massive that effectively it won't matter if any single company stands out from an ESG perspective, because the baseline risks are not being managed, and therefore a lot of funders in particular are going to start factoring that into credit risk for the entire sector. If they realize that, listen, some of these risks are so massive that there's nothing that this one company can do. So we're going to pretty much have to factor it into the credit risk rating of the entire sector, irrespective of what efforts the individual companies is actually undertaking, then everyone loses. And it's important, therefore, to come to some kind of consensus at an industry level as to what the challenges are and what all industry players need to do in order to resolve them. Then you've got your multi-stakeholder partnerships, where governments, private society, and civil society organizations come together to tackle complex challenges. And this could, if properly used, can effectively help in breaking down some of the regulatory barriers that make a just transition and make an ESG or a low carbon economy very difficult to reach. So, it requires a certain level of innovation. And here as well, I think, each element of the, of these groups, like the government's, private sector, civil society, they have to acknowledge the strengths and weaknesses of the other elements of society. Because, governments, as I've said, very much held back by red tape. But similarly, private sector, very worried about, insular matters, but not thinking of the bigger picture. And so there's potential for each of those groups to see things from a different perspective. And those different perspectives will then help in coming up with a solution to a sustainability issue that actually endures, as opposed to taking a single kind of approach that doesn't take into account the needs of the other key role players. So when we're talking about impact, I think it's very different from outcomes, because outcomes are, they are what they are, positive or negative. And sometimes you can stumble onto an outcome without necessarily having created long-term impact. But the ability to create impact, to actually change, materially change the lives of one or more stakeholders, is a long-term goal. It is very difficult to achieve, but what is quite clear is that impact is heightened once partnerships get involved in a company's ESG initiative. But the offset of that is that the more a company involves other stakeholders in the process, then the less attributable that impact becomes to that company that initiated the particular ESG partnership or initiative. So if you've got 10 different companies that all came together to achieve, let's say an enterprise and supply development program that resulted in the creation of 500,000 jobs, it is very difficult to then try and attribute the creation of those 500,000 jobs to any one company within that partnership. So that is the trade-off that you will have to make. All right, so just a few examples of partnerships in this context. Sustainable financing is an easy one in the sense that you are involving an issuer, a funder, or one or more funders, actually, employees or potentially contractors who are actually implementing the sustainability initiative, and then the target beneficiaries who are actually benefiting and whose lives are being changed by the sustainability initiative that is being capitalized through a sustainable financing framework. And even though it is still very much a growing area, I think it is an example of how different sections of the private sector can come together to actually address a real need, especially for beneficiaries who are in underserved and marginalized communities who cannot have access or do not have access to the same level of resources and opportunities that their more privileged counterparts have. So, I mean, an easy example would be providing affordable housing or implementing a small to medium enterprise program, something that really helps groups that perhaps would otherwise not have received that kind of help. Other examples would include suppliers who have innovative and sustainable goods and services and partnering with those suppliers. I think we probably need to do more as the private sector to start incentivizing suppliers to think out of the box, but also to start offering green products and services to us. And also noting that a lot of the suppliers are really operating in a way that they're not serving any one company. You'll find that one supplier will service, or a small group of suppliers will service a number of companies within the same industry, simply because of, those are kind of the big wigs, as it were. So making sure that those suppliers are taking steps to green their offering, but also taking steps to develop smaller enterprises within their own value chains, I think has a lot of potential and merit. So also civil society organizations and partnering with those civil society organizations to actually achieve key ESG objectives, but also to draw on their knowledge and resources and disseminating those resources as far as possible. So it's not just a matter of, well, I'm going to get resources from some of these organizations and I'm going to keep them for myself, but really encouraging other players in the industry, or suppliers or customers, to also get in touch with those organizations so that they can also benefit from those resources. And then lastly, your customers, who can sometimes have the greatest impact on your ESG approach, because sometimes the largest section of impact that can be created is changing customer behavior. It's certainly true in the real estate sector. I'm sure it's true in other sectors as well. It's really about, because yes, it is about the creator of the product, but it's also about how the product is used, how the product is consumed, and how the product is thereafter disposed of. So every key element downstream the value chain can potentially be impacted by customers and responsible customer behavior from a sustainability perspective. All right, so my voice is a bit tired, so I'm going to hand over to you, Dikshita, for questions. And I see the chat has been quite active, so I'm looking forward to answering the questions.
Wow. Thank you, Annalisa. I actually just wanted, I was following the customer behavior. Like, if you could just elaborate slightly for me, I could not catch like every point that you made. If we could just go back there and just elaborate further on that last point for me.
Sure
Yes.
thing. So I think when it comes to customers, in this context, we're talking about the stakeholder who uses the product that the company has created or distributed and eventually disposes of it. And if there's an opportunity to embed this concept of responsible customer behavior when they are actually using the product, firstly, because that in itself can have an ESG impact, and then disposing of the product. So an easy example would be, at a mall, what the customer does with, a used container. Does the customer simply throw it in the normal bin and keep moving? Or does the customer look for a recycling bin that is appropriate and then uses that to dispose of that particular product? So that is not something that the manufacturer or even the distributor of that container can control directly, but they can encourage the customer through labeling, through working with the mall itself to use that product responsibly between the time that it is purchased and the time that it is disposed of.
Okay. You're right. That's make it sounds better, clearer for me. Thank you very much. I've got another question that I'd like to ask you. While we speak of integrating sustainability initiatives, engaging in such initiatives, what could be the potential challenges, the highly possible challenges that any organization would be facing?
I think the two biggest challenges for me would be, number one, awareness, because a lot of people have certain preconceptions about what ESG is and why a business should actually take it seriously. So, for example, a lot of companies still think that ESG is a marketing initiative and should be treated as such, and that leads to a lot of greenwashing, because then people focus more on the superficial initiatives that are good for a photo op instead of focusing on the real nitty-gritty initiatives, which often are not suitable for a photo op at all. But they focus on those because for them, they are more concerned about what people think of them and less concerned about whether or not their business is indeed a responsible corporate citizen. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, I think, is maintaining momentum, especially when it comes to introducing changes to the business model. So, it's great to get the excitement going in the first month or so. It's topical and everybody's talking about it, and you can marry it to a nice little initiative internally and award people who come up with innovative sustainability ideas. That's great, but getting people to continuously think about it and continuously improve over time is very difficult, especially when people become stressed, they become busy, they start thinking about their quote unquote day jobs. And then the ESG initiatives that were really going to drive progress, that were innovative and exciting, they start to fall by the wayside.
All right. Thank you. We've got two questions in our Q&A box here. We've got a question from Fikri, all the way from Indonesia. Fikri asks, does driving ESG agenda mean sacrificing company returns?
Sure. So the short answer to that is no. Certainly, you will have certain ESG initiatives that have a higher financial yield than others. That is correct. But at the same time, you will find that in the context of funding, if you can raise a sustainability-linked bond or a green bond, that can sometimes come at a lower cost of capital. And depending on how aggressive the ESG related targets are that are associated with that bond, you can really start to see a lowering of cost of capital as well as diversification of actual funding sources. Because there is a lot of potential funding out there, but it is earmarked for ESG initiatives. So if you can position yourself in that way, you can potentially access cheaper funding. That's one of them. Cost reduction is certainly another. So in South Africa, for example, electricity is grid supplied, it is coal-fired, and it is expensive. The tariff rates are quite high. So if we manage to, for example, start harnessing renewable energy sources, yes, it's going to require a short-term CapEx investment, but in the long term, looking at the savings from not having to purchase electricity from the national energy grid at those tariffs, you actually end up with a substantial cost saving. So obviously, it would need to be judged on a case-by-case basis, but yes, there is potential to generate company returns.
Okay, thank you, Anlisa. I hope this answers your question, Fikri. Anlisa, I'm just going to ask you to let's stop sharing and let's just have a discussion over the few questions that we've got. Right, that's correct. I see we've got Indonesia, some African countries, people from these regions. I have this question for you, Anlisa. When we speak of collaboration or partnerships in order to accelerate ESG, let's put this in the context of emerging markets. What do you think are the key elements that we should be looking from emerging countries, emerging markets, right, in order to accelerate this ESG impact through partnerships?
Well, I think the first thing is to understand where each company is currently ranked from an ESG perspective, because the in-country realities are going to be quite critical. And that's why a useful proxy for that is the SDG tracker that I showed you earlier, because that gives you an indication of how well some of the the countries are doing versus how badly some of them are doing. And even though it is the SDGs, a lot of people think it's this disembodied kind of metric. It is often reflected in the operating environment that a lot of companies in those emerging markets are having to deal with. So, for example, in South Africa, and I'm sure it's the same in a lot of other African countries, you've got decent work and economic growth. We're doing very badly on that as a country, and we are stagnating. Within South Africa's context, that is borne out by the numbers because we have the highest unemployment rate in the world. So using that as a proxy gives you an indication of what the challenges would be in that particular jurisdiction, because from our side, the knock-on effect of that decent work and economic growth SDG not being met is that we are struggling to see real economic growth. We are struggling to see, and that means for us, we're struggling to get new tenants in. And by new tenants, I don't mean, the existing companies on the market renting our spaces. I mean brand new startups that can potentially use our spaces. So understanding how those goals then translate into challenges that the businesses are actually facing, I think can then help us come to some kind of common ground. Because otherwise, I think it is very difficult to then come and say, well, I have no idea what's going on up in Rwanda. I'll just assume that their challenges are the same as mine. And maybe they aren't. Maybe they are dealing with things that South Africa in some aspects is doing much worse on. And maybe there are some areas where South Africa is actually doing a lot better. And understanding how those would then play out, I think would be a critical first step in formulating those partnerships and seeing where the opportunity is to collaborate.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Annalisa. I think we've got one last question that we would take before we close. So Fikri asked, how can an organization build an ESG framework and partnership that is future-proofed for tomorrow's economic realities? He says this is particularly relevant due to the current frequent uncertainties, etc.
Look, I think in this context, it is important to model out the risks and opportunities in the long term. It requires a company to, or a responsible individual to constantly research emerging trends, because those trends over time are going to become the new reality that the company has to adapt itself to and has to be able to partner with other entities in order to actually adapt accordingly. So, Uber 10 years ago was probably not a reality for a lot of us, and we all used the yellow cabs and we were all happy with our lives. These days, unfortunately, a lot of metered cabs are becoming anachronistic. The economy can change so drastically in such a short period of time. It's important to then say, all right, before that happens, what are some of the things that are coming up? Because I'm sure back in 2012, Uber was just starting up and, it was here and there, but it wasn't really as ubiquitous as it is today. And those are the things that I think you need to constantly be aware of and constantly researching and constantly speaking to your peers, as well as other key partners within you, the corporate sector, to find out what are the new technologies that they're talking about, they're thinking about. What are they worried about? What are the investors? What is keeping your investor base up at night? And understanding how those considerations could become part of your reality. And it is going to be a bit of a Noah's Ark kind of situation, in the sense that, according to the biblical story, when Noah was building the ark, he was building it on dry land, and he looked nuts. Because people said, what are you doing? It's broad daylight and you're building this giant boat. Because he was preparing for something that was going to happen, but at the time seemed completely impossible.
Makes totally sense. I think that should answer to your question, Fikri. All right, I think we've also reached the end of our webinar. We've used our 1 hour effectively. Thank you so much, Annalisa, for joining us. I know you've been having a very tight schedule in the past 1 month and we've been back and forth, but thank you so much. It's been exciting to have you on our platform, and definitely we would be looking forward for future collaborations with you and future engagements on different levels. Right, and to the attendees as well, thank you for making time, joining us. I know you're coming from all corners of the world, so we'll see you in our next webinar. All right, so take care.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great week.
Yes, bye-bye, Annalisa.
Cheers, bye.
Bye.